Hello, everyone. My name is Saurish Srivastava, and I'm your host on the Dialexicon podcast, where we critically engage in philosophy and correlate philosophy research to contemporary issues. Today, with us, we have Professor Anand Vaidya from San José State University, who teaches philosophy and is an occasional director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy. Hi, Professor Vaidya. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Thank you very much for having me on this podcast.
Thanks. That's fantastic. And of course, okay, with the introductions kind of done, let's move on to our discussion today, where we're going to be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into some of your research and studies and what you personally think about philosophy. So briefly, for our audience that may not know you, could you please provide a little bit more information on who you are, your background, and what your relationship to philosophy is?
So my name is Anand Vaidya, and I am a professor of philosophy at San Jose State University. I did my undergraduate work at the University of California, Los Angeles, after I was at Humboldt State University for 2 years. I finished my BA at UCLA, and then I went to the University of California, Santa Barbara, and spent 5 years there doing graduate work. Most of my undergraduate and graduate work was in Western analytical philosophy, focusing on mathematical logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of language and logic. So that was my background training. I had some good introduction to history in Western philosophy, but mostly all history of Western philosophy. And I did a special focus with work on Immanuel Kant and Ludwig Wittgenstein. So two historical figures I was very interested in and remain interested in. My relationship to philosophy is I'm a professor of philosophy and I do research all over the world. And I, as a director of the Center for Comparative Philosophy, my job was to travel to different parts of the world and do philosophy with people from different cultures. So I went to India a lot for 10 years to do research over there, did some research in China, New Zealand, Australia, Scotland, England, Germany, Spain, Italy. So I've been all over doing research and giving talks. I've been to South America, and I continue to do research all over the world. I'm primarily interested in questions about the nature of what it means to know something and how we can know things, which is a big topic in epistemology. And then I'm interested in philosophy of mind, primarily in what the nature of consciousness is and how we can identify and understand it across different sorts of organisms or types of creatures. But I also work in business ethics. I teach a class on business ethics. I teach a class on theories of justice, like the capabilities approach. I've done work in philosophy of economics, ethical theory. I teach mathematical logic sometimes. Sometimes I teach seminars in moral psychology. So I do a lot of different kinds of teaching in my thing, but my research is primarily in epistemology and philosophy of mind. And at this stage of my career, I spend a lot of time looking at it from a cross-cultural and multidisciplinary perspective. So I look a lot at what's going on in classical Indian epistemology and how can that be brought into contact meaningfully with analytic epistemology, and same with philosophy of mind. And I try to look a lot at like what other disciplines like cognitive science or neuroscience or physics can help us, how it can help us understand the nature of knowledge and the nature of the mind. That's kind of like the areas I work in. That's basically where I'm.
So our topic today revolves more around, like you were saying, philosophy of mind and consciousness in general, but specifically in the context of artificial intelligence and maybe a future potential for an artificial consciousness. And so I wanted to ask you just directly what the difference between artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and artificial consciousness is. Because for a lot of people, they might think that all three of those things can generally be the same. Or they could, obviously, there are going to be variations of artificial intelligence in some way, shape, or form. But is there a specific difference that can delineate between artificial general intelligence and artificial consciousness and artificial intelligence? All three of those.
Okay, so I can definitely answer those questions, but I just want to make it clear to your audience and to you that I'm not approaching this from the background of a programmer. I'm not looking at this as a discipline-specific issue about programming. So if your questions, or if anybody's concerned about how what I say maps into the way in which people who are computer scientists are talking about these things, I would just definitely warn them at the beginning that it might not be the same. It might not obviously be that we're cutting up the space the same way for the same purposes. So for example, the first thing I'd point out is that I don't really put much weight on the word artificial versus non-artificial. In fact, it could be the case that within the sphere of computer science, what that really means is something substantive. But in the case in which I would think about it, it's not really that important to me that it's artificial versus non-artificial. All that it means to me that it's artificial is that it's basically not the human case. I don't really know that we are using the word artificial in any really cooked up, loaded sense that we might associate with the word artificial, other than the fact that we mean that it's not coming from us like directly. It's not a direct experience of consciousness. It's produced by something else that we've sort of played a role in making. So I don't know if, if you want to look at this in sort of an analogical way, you could say, like, if we are somehow the creators of AI and relative to us, AI is artificial consciousness because we are the creators of it, then maybe you might think, well, hey, if God is conscious, then God's the creator of us, and therefore we have some sort of maybe artificial consciousness relative to that. So I don't really take the word artificial that seriously. All that means to me is that the kind of thing that's being said to be conscious or not conscious is different from a human. At this stage, I don't really know what more we could mean by that. So maybe another difference to be relatively important here is sort of like, like a rabbit. If a rabbit's conscious, it's not a human, but it's also not an artificial intelligence. So there's forms of non-human consciousness. We explore that. Plants might be conscious. Rabbits are conscious. Octopi seem to be very conscious. So there's a difference between it being like artificial in the sense of what is it made out of? Like that's a relevant question. And then there's another one about it being non-human. But if we define it in terms of it being non-human, then rabbits have artificial consciousness. That sounds a little bit weird. If we define it in being non-carbon based, then that seems to track a little bit more this issue of like what sorts of substrates can silicon substrates be the realization base for consciousness. So that's the first thing. I don't take much stake in artificial. Second point is that you talked about AGI. So AGI typically means artificial general intelligence. So I think here the word that's important is the general and not the artificial part, right? So general intelligence here, in the sense that we want to talk about, is the difference between something like Deep Blue or AlphaGo that can play a really complex game very well and beat the leading players in the game, but can't tell you what time it is, basically, right? So AGI is basically, or drop the A, general intelligence is referring to the fact that the system, be it human or not, or a rabbit or not, can do many things, and it can do them at a high degree of proficiency, even if it's not expert in all those domains. And AGI is a way of talking about intelligence that's like that. And a lot of artificial systems don't exhibit AGI. They exhibit, in fact, very domain-specific things that are very rudimentary, right? Maybe things like AlphaGo and Deep Blue are systems that can play really complex games and succeed and beat human beings about it, but it's not the case that they have AGI, although they have very good domain-specific expertise. So the difference between AGI and human consciousness and artificial consciousness isn't really the way to cut things up. Like the artificial just means it's for like a system like, a machine system instead of a human, and the general just means what is the width of what it can cover. So if it's non-AGI, it's like an expert system that can only play chess, and if it's AGI, it can do a lot more different things. And then there's another further issue of what is the base across which AGI holds. So if a system can play chess and AlphaGo, for example, and it can play checkers and any other sort of strategic game, does that make it an AGI because it can play more than one game? Maybe not. Maybe to be AGI, you have to go do something like bake a cake and play chess. Okay, so the base that you spread the variation across, and you say it's general intelligence because it can do a variety of different things, cannot be a variety of things that clump all underneath the same fundamental node. So and by node, I don't mean a node in a neural network. So I mean a node in terms of a decision tree about what type of intelligence it's exhibiting. So it can't be that it's all doing the same sort of like, strategic game playing, and that makes it AGI all of a sudden because there's 15 different games it can play. So that's a question about AGI. So I don't know how much more you want to know about that, but the more salient distinction that we want to draw early on are what are the different types of consciousness we have, not what is the difference between artificial and non-artificial consciousness.
Okay, so given that I guess the distinction between artificial and non-artificial is kind of irrelevant at this stage, just because we need to map out a prior understanding of what consciousness is to even explore artificial consciousness, right?
Right.
What would you think are, or what are the current, I guess, formations of consciousness that we've explored so far? If you could.
So I think if yeah, so just the distinction that's the most common distinction that I'm aware of that's drawn in the literature that's relevant to artificial consciousness is the distinction that was proposed by Ned Block, who's a professor of philosophy of mind at New York University, where he proposed a distinction between what is known as phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. And the best way to understand the difference between this is by studying patients that have certain forms of brain damage, or maybe we can even leave out the brain damage part. The fact is they have a condition, and that condition is called blind sight. And basically what happens with the subject that has blind sight is that they report an inability to see anything in the left-hand side of their visual field, but then when you repeatedly ask them to perform a certain task, like pick up a pen in the left-hand side of their visual field, they do it reliably every time. Or for example, you might say to them, hey, can you walk down this hallway? And they're like, well, I can't see anything down the left side of my visual field in the hallway. How do you expect me to do that? And just go do it. Just go give it a shot. And lo and behold, they perfectly navigate this thing. So this seems to show some dissociation between, a tracking phenomenon that doesn't have a phenomenal presentation to it, like seeing what the corridor looks like or seeing what the pen looks like, but they're able to perform some task. So access consciousness is oftentimes correlated with this idea that we have purposive, like you have a purpose and intention, and it's a guided action. You can report on the action, you can talk about it, you can perform it reliably, you can do it in different contexts. And that's contrasted with phenomenal consciousness, where there's something that it's like to see red, or something like to smell curry, or something it's like to hear see sharp, right? So there's the what it's like component of consciousness, and that's usually what people most often that don't study consciousness think about. They think about the what it's like feeling, the what is it like to undergo a certain kind of experience, the feeling component of it. This is sometimes why people think that like emotions are something particularly human, because they have a feeling component. We don't understand how robots can feel things. We'll get to that later if you want to, but for now, the main point is just that what's going on is that in access consciousness, we have an ability to have intelligent action, but we don't have what it's like. And so when people talk about artificial consciousness, there are two different streams of thought. One stream of thought is we're talking about realizing the what it's like component that we feel when we have an experience within an artificial system. And by artificial here, we mean it's made out of stuff other than what we're made out of at a certain level of description. And basically, that's one way of looking at it. So one is like, I want to make phenomenal consciousness happen inside of a robot that is, or an artificial system that's made out of, non-humany stuff at a certain level of description. And then the other one is to say, well, look, we have another notion of consciousness that we know of. It's called access consciousness. And if there's a link between access consciousness and something like artificial general intelligence, then we can talk about making a system access conscious and maybe getting AGI off the ground. So there are people that work on that particular type of relationship, like how do you talk about AGI in relationship to access consciousness? So typically, there's a couple of different things that are going on in this area, and I think it's very important to separate them out. So one is that we separate these two types of consciousness from one another when we're seeking an exploration in this area. And the other one, which is also a very, very common mistake, I can tell your audience members that the most common mistake I've heard from leading experts, both in computer science and in philosophy, is the confusion about the relationship between intelligence and consciousness. So these are not the same thing. Yet various times people talk about machine intelligence and machine consciousness in the same breath as if we're talking about the same thing. So one thing to keep in mind is that talking about a system becoming more and more intelligent doesn't necessarily go along with it being phenomenally conscious, right? An increase in intelligence isn't an increase in phenomenal consciousness. And it could be the case that at certain degrees of intelligence, like phenomenal consciousness, it just becomes irrelevant. So it's really important to just make sure you're understanding that intelligence is one thing we can aim for in talking about artificial systems. And that doesn't necessarily have to bring along with it phenomenal consciousness. However, it could be the case that intelligence has a direct relationship to access consciousness, right? Not phenomenal consciousness. So these distinctions help: access versus phenomenal, and intelligence versus consciousness, right? So I would always tell someone when they're asking questions about AI and things like that to try and keep those things separate, because a lot of confusion comes about from confusing those ideas.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense, especially in the context of like the two distinctive theories of consciousness, as well as like this distinction between like intelligence and consciousness, because that those two things I think often, especially in like computer science, are conflated to say that if a machine is able to get like reach a certain threshold of intelligence, then they're kind of like established as like a conscious or kind or subconscious or something like that, where they're almost reaching a level of like the human, right? Which is what we talk about with like, I guess, like with AI, almost reaching the level of human. But given that like those level, like given the distinction between consciousness and intelligence, that isn't necessarily possible, right?
No, it's not necessarily true.
True. Sorry. Yeah.
It could be correlated. It could be the case that one brings along the other. It's just very complicated. And what I've noticed is that when you listen to a lot of the leading experts in computer science and in philosophy, they just simply make this mistake because to tell you the truth, I just don't think they read Alan Turing carefully. The problem comes from Alan Turing's work, because a lot of people think that Alan Turing's paper has something to do with consciousness, yet nowhere in the paper does he discuss consciousness at all, outside of the fact that it might be an objection to the view he's making about machine intelligence. Turing's work was about intelligence, and a lot of his arguments are about why we would stop ourselves from saying that machines are intelligent, right? And so even if his arguments succeed to show that you must say that a machine is intelligent, they won't succeed to say that it's phenomenally conscious, because the arguments just aren't about that. So we have to separate out intelligence and consciousness. And then also we have to separate out the distinction between knowing that someone else is conscious and treating them as if they're conscious because we don't have any evidence that they're not conscious. So for example, I might say, other than the fact that you emailed me, I don't have any real evidence, as Descartes said, that you're not a robot. I mean, maybe you're just a cleverly disguised, little Indian kid with, who's really a robot, from, NASA or something like that. And they're trying to interview me to figure out about how we should treat space aliens, since I have a theory about AI and rights and things like that. So who knows what's going on here? Maybe you're like working for the CIA or something. But see, the point is that the fact that I can't know for sure that you're conscious, and the fact that I can't tell that an AI system is intelligent when I ask it questions, doesn't mean that it's not intelligent or that you are conscious. Those are two different questions. One question is about what does it take for a system to be conscious or to be intelligent, and the other one is there any test I can perform that's good enough to separate out what's going on with me from what's going on with the system, right? So there's a couple. I just want to make sure that you're aware that like there are a couple of different distinctions here that if we keep in mind, it helps the conversation go smoother.
Okay, yeah. So I guess let's rotate back to the example you gave about emotions and how that can correlate with AI. So there is this like AI field called emotional AI where they try to have AI process emotions. So in that sort of regard, like, do you think? I mean, I know you've referenced elsewhere like Peter Singer's work in the context of like a moral status, where you just need to like feel pain and suffering in order to have a moral status. So how does that theory of moral status relate to a position of like consciousness or an understanding of consciousness? Are those two things
Okay, those
related?
things are, there's a connection that can be made, but I just want to separate the first thing that you said. Nothing about the nature of emotions is relevant to that question. So here's one question that in my class kids oftentimes like are very interested in. They want to like, can data have emotions, or can an AI have an emotion? Now, whatever answer I give to that question, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden it has moral status because it has emotions, right? Those aren't connected. So there is another theory which says that anything that has the capacity to suffer can have a moral status. That's related to what Peter Singer is talking about, basically. And so the idea is that things that can suffer in the sense of I guess when Peter's talking about it, he's talking more specifically about feeling physical pain, right? And so he's basically saying those things that can feel physical pain have moral standing, and those things that cannot feel physical pain don't really have moral standing. There are a couple of technical problems with stating things that way that we can get into, but for now, let's just stay with the very flat-footed thing. If you can suffer, you have some kind of moral standing, and if you can't suffer at all, then you don't have any moral standing. Putting aside these other problems that can creep in right away. So then people will argue, well, my grandpa can suffer, but no artificial intelligence system that I know can feel pain yet. So AIs don't have any rights on the basis of the capacity to suffer, right? Okay, so that's a standard argument. But again, this argument really kind of rests on a crucial premise, which is kind of connected to the question you were asking earlier about emotions, which is it really true that the only way to suffer is through physical pain? Is there another way to suffer which has more to do with cognitive activity as opposed to physical pain? So cognitive pain of a certain kind, or some sort of cognitive understanding that's a form of suffering. So if you think that cognitive suffering is something that can happen, then you might think, oh, it just turns out to be the case that AIs don't have physical pain because they don't have the nerve endings that we have that transmit sensory pain from the surface of our skin or the internal organs to our brain. They don't have anything like nociceptive fibers or anything like that. That's fine. But you might think, why is suffering exhausted by only being able to feel something physically? So if you think that, for example, some AIs can have cognitive suffering, then maybe it's wrong to think that they don't suffer. And so that's a way things can go. So one way the argument can go is that people who are interested in using suffering as a way of demarcating the moral sphere might simply say, well, AIs can't suffer, so they're not in the moral sphere. We can do whatever we want to them. Turning them off is just fine. Other people might come the other direction and say, no, what we're learning through research on AI is that maybe there's another type of suffering that we have not focused on because we've been so interested in the relationship between physical pain and different animals and plants and how they react and what's going on with them in their nervous system.
So, and just to confirm, none of this would mean that an AI wouldn't be able to process human emotions. It just means that the AI itself wouldn't have its own emotions. Is that correct?
Okay, well, first, let's get into that question now, because you're asking that question. I think it's probably important to unpack some of what's going on there. So in general, the way you're talking about processing, I think what you're pretty much getting on is you're talking actually really about predicting, basically. So there are AI systems that can say, oh, this person seems depressed based on the search words that they type in, and basically the way their physical face looks, their grimace, their affect level in their body, skin conductivity, whether they use visible sweat, I don't know. I know what you're talking about, but yes, so that's a model that is aimed at prediction based on, tone of voice and things like that. So predicting an emotion does not depend on having an emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's the direction you were going for. That's correct. Yeah. However, the other direction also doesn't hold, which is someone who has emotions doesn't mean they're necessarily good at predicting other people's emotions. Yeah. Okay, so that fails too. In addition, also, in philosophy of mind, when we study what emotions are, we typically distinguish between two components, if not three components. So one component of an emotion is kind of like the profile of what it is as a mental state. So anger is different than joy. And someone might say, well, anger is different in joy because they feel different. And someone else might say, well, they do feel different, but isn't what's really important is that anger is about someone having wronged you and joy is about something that elates you? Isn't it that they're about something and their intentionality, what the mental state is about in general is different? Okay, So there's typically two different ways of telling it what emotions are. One is by being a cognitivist. A cognitivist basically thinks that the attitude, not the feeling, defines what the emotion is. And a non-cognitivist says, well, more like the feeling is what defines what an emotion is, not the attitude, right? And so it really becomes difficult. So if you're someone who says emotions are essentially defined by the feelings that accompany them, then it's going to be the case that unless we figure out how an AI can have phenomenal consciousness, it won't be the case that it can have any emotions, because you basically said, if you don't feel it, you don't have it. Okay. So that's one way of going. You don't feel love. If you don't feel love, you don't have love, basically. If you don't feel anger, you don't have anger. Now, the other way of going is basically saying, well, maybe you're angry, but you're just really, really good at suppressing the feeling and your behavior because you've trained in, Vipassana meditation for 10 years, and you now know how to like control your inner states from their arising and influencing across your body. So in that kind of case, maybe someone's angry because they have the mental attitude, because they're not enlightened yet, but they have the ability to suppress their physical actions and their emotional disturbance inside their body in terms of like how it makes them anxiety, changes their breathing and stuff like this. So in those cases, maybe someone might want to say the reality is that we're learning that the emotion is really about some attitude, and those feelings, they come along with it, but those feelings don't define what the emotion is. Now, if the feelings don't define what the emotions are, then clearly it could be the case that we can understand how exactly an artificial system could have an emotion, because they can be susceptible to an input-output program, which says if you get these certain inputs, instantiate the attitudinal state of anger without the feeling state of anger and act in these ways, right? So, someone who's angry at someone for hurting them might, have the attitude of wanting to scream or punch back or something like that. But those movements and actions, they don't depend on the feeling, they just depend on the attitude of anger. Do you get it? The difference? Feeling versus attitude. So it's not even clear to me that in the future artificial systems can't have emotions. What's I think many people confuse in this conversation is they like to say things like, well, what it is to have an emotion is to feel something, and I don't know how like a silicon system can feel anything, so it can't have an emotion. I think that misses the point. That's the same thing with access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. So access consciousness is one way of doing things, but phenomenal consciousness is one way of defining consciousness. So is access consciousness. So there are other ideas in the area that can help us understand that. But in general, for your first question, you're correct, at least my understanding. The fact that an artificial system can detect emotions doesn't really tell us much about whether it can have emotions. There are some people I think would be inclined to say the following, though. Only a system that can have certain higher level emotions is going to be able to detect those kinds of higher level emotions. Let me give you an example. Like being able to tell someone's depressed or angry, I think is not going to be a hard task for an AI system that doesn't have emotions. Okay, but I think if I ask an AI system to detect Schadenfreude, which is a higher level emotion, I think it'll be a lot more complex. And there I don't know. I don't know if there's a correlation between having certain emotional states and being able to predict them, maybe not reliably, but being able to predict them, but which is a form of intelligence. It's like only if you have certain emotions can you make the jump to predict these types of emotions and others, versus this issue of just predicting baseline emotions like joy or depression and stuff like that. Like there's not that many markers you probably need to predict someone's degree of depression. I mean, if they have a certain kind of tone of voice and facial gaze, it's probably not that hard. So yeah, I would say basically, yeah, it's not going to be the case that detection is the same as instantiation. What is really going to be the case is whether or not there's a really reliable way of detecting for complex things that doesn't depend on instantiation.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. I was just kind of confused on like whether or not prediction itself would necessarily imply that the AI would have the ability to process emotions or have emotions.
So,
And I
but
guess
again,
actually that's a good question too. What's the difference, if there is one, between processing emotion and having emotions?
oh, so, right. That's why I was I was unclear with what you meant by process myself. So I don't pick up on that. So So I can have so I'm looking at you, right? And let's and one thing I can be doing, I can have a query in my head. What is the emotional state of my interlocutor? What's your emotional state? So when I ask myself that question, I can then start to process evidence from your body and the tone of voice in order to determine what emotion you have. So there I'm processing information to figure out what your emotion is. Right. So I think of the distinction as not about processing, but the direction. Is the direction figuring out what's going on with some other entity or person, or is it the direction something about what's going on with me, myself, the system?
That's what I was. That's what I was
So
targeting.
having an emotion is going to involve processing the emotion that you're having, right? Right. Anger has duration over time. It has changes in heartbeat. It has changes, a lot of somatic effects that go on. So it seems to me like when you're having an emotion, basically what's going on is that you're processing the anger that's going on at the moment. So that's processing, but that's processing about the emotion in your body. But then the thing is, if you're detecting an emotion in another person, you're processing evidence to figure out what their emotion is, right? So you're not processing the emotion the same way. Yeah. I mean, there are cases where in human to human interaction, there is some sort of direct neural process. There's a phenomenon known as contagion, emotional contagion, when you pick up the emotion of another person directly just by being around them. There's another one called mirror neuron reflection, where so all of those things sort of, they kind of come into this space of like, yeah, you might be processing the same emotion someone else is having, but I'm not sure that that's going to be showing up in the AI stuff. There's no mirror neuron type of activity going on right now because there are no mirror neurons right now between AI and humans. So,
okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I guess my next question is kind of tailored to something you've talked, like you've written elsewhere about assertion. So assertion in the context of, I mean, I guess we can use even emotions here. Like, is it possible to have a robot or an AI or some artificial system assert its own emotion? And would that assertion be like enough to determine the authenticity of that emotion?
yeah, I think the second part of it is, so both parts of this are pretty technical actually. So can I have an AI system, say things and then have other people basically accept what they say without challenging them and being like, really? Like, like if Data says like, oh, I love Clarissa, will they be like, really? Or something like that.
Yeah.
So I get the question you're asking, but for the purposes of answering it, I don't think the sort of like watered down version really helps. I think this is one of those cases where philosophy gets technical and technical stuff really matters actually. So the problem you're referring to kind of is the parrot problem, which is the way I describe it, which is like people ask me a lot of times like, well, if the artificial system tells us that, it's in pain, why shouldn't we believe it's in pain? Or, if it tells us it needs certain things, why should we not believe it, or should we believe it, or what's going on with those things? And a lot of the problem for me, and this is a technical issue, just really has to do with the difference between what it is to assert and what it is to kind of repeat or respond. So the thing is, it's obvious in the case from the name of the problem is, if I say something and a parrot repeats it, we don't really think like the parrot is saying it. We think it's parroting it. That's why we call it parroting it. So there's a term even for what they're doing. And there's a way in which, like, if a parrot's me saying I'm sick, I'm not going to be like, oh, you're sick, because you didn't really assert anything. So yeah, we need a theory of assertion for artificial systems. That's basically a serious philosophical project, and it's not easy to figure out what are the connecting dots. Part of it is because assertion is connected with free will. Assertion is connected with choice. So when I assert something, I'm choosing. So the reason why we don't think this way very often is because we make a distinction that is artificial. We think of the word action as always applying to physical bodily actions. We forget that there are mental actions. Assertion is a mental action, just as judgment is, or inference. Inference is another mental action. So mental actions suffer from the same problem that free will, when we talk about ordinary behavior, does. So if the mental action requires freedom, like assertion does, then we might think, well, if the computer system doesn't really have the ability to do anything otherwise or say anything otherwise, then it's really not an assertion. And so there's two ways to study this problem. And the way I prefer to study it is through the comparative method of comparing what goes on with humans at different stages of their life, like a 5-year-old, 7-year-old, a 20-year-old, an 80-year-old, non-human animals like orangutans or monkeys who have shown the ability to count and engage in various types of speech behavior, octopi. So responding obviously is, like sort of a digital thing, yes or no, basically. And so, it seems like, can we interact with animals in a way where they're giving us authentic responses? I think the answer to that is genuinely yes. I think there's a lot of very good evidence that animals can genuinely respond to us. But when we start thinking we're teaching them how to speak English or something like that, are they asserting those things or are they parroting them? I'm not sure yet what exactly. I'm not an animal psychologist that I can go that deep into that. But when I look at it comparatively, I stop there. So I think in order to make progress on the real issue of what we have to say about the responses that come out of an artificial system, we would need to look carefully at what a theory of assertion is. And the basic problem is the difference between parroting and asserting, which also sometimes requires this idea of assenting. So if I assert something and I'm not lying, I also assent to it. So if I assert that there are two people in this Zoom room, it's not just that I'm saying those words, I'm also assenting, meaning I believe cognitively in my head. So assertion requires some mental things going on in the right way. And it requires, also assertion is oftentimes governed by knowledge. So you're only supposed to assert what you know. It's called a knowledge account of assertion. So there are technical things here where I think philosophers can do a lot of good work figuring this out in the province of AI. But I think the way to do it is comparatively. So what's the difference between a child learning from their parents how to speak some stuff and them parroting versus authentically and asserting? And what's that relationship between a system that engages in deep learning, for example? Like how do we think of those as being similar or different in important ways? And so one thing might be, well, it's made out of silicon and it's not made out of human gunk stuff. Some people say that difference really matters, and other people who like David Chalmers at NYU also doesn't think that substrate matters. He's like, oh, it should be able to come around for whatever matters. And other people are like, no, the substrate matters. That's why humans can do cool stuff and other people can't, or other creatures can't. So it really depends on how you look at it. So assertion is important. It does have to do with being able to look at the authenticity of what people are saying. But I don't think we should look at these questions in a flat-footed way. We shouldn't be like, hey, what would be really cool is if we just looked at this question and thought we could give an answer without thinking comparatively. Because I think that's part of what happens in a lot of these debates is that people give these non-comparative answers. They're like, well, yeah, clearly, artificial systems can't have any free will. They're all pre-programmed. Didn't Ada Lovelace teach us that? That's the most famous objection, from Charles Babbage. And then you're like, well, wait a minute. I mean, aren't all us humans going to school to learn math and arithmetic and follow rules too? Like, what are you talking about? Like there seems to be like some base level at which we don't have the freedom to choose because we're programmed initially to choose based on a program for choosing, right? So what are you talking about? Why are you? So a comparative study across different sorts of animals and plants. I think plants is a really good place to look at what's going on with plants also. Can really help us get an understanding of things. I mean, and also you should be careful to, distinguish between the philosophical engagement with these questions that are not concerned with policy and the pragmatic policy thing. So I don't have anything to say about policy and pragmatic issues. I'm a philosopher. I'm interested genuinely in the question of what is the difference between a plant being conscious, Watson the computer, and an 8-year-old baby, right? So I'm just theoretically, I'm not telling you how to have policy for AI and everything right now. I'm thinking there's a genuine question there. What's going on in terms of the nervous system, in terms of the complexity, in terms of what kinds of thoughts it can have, the value of those thoughts. I'm thinking like, why are these different similar? I'm thinking about capacities and how good it is to rest things on capacities. So there's a very important, condition that we can learn about humans, for example, to help us understand things. So some humans suffer from what's known as pain asymbolia. So pain asymbolia is basically the inability to feel pain. So if we ran, Peter Singer's argument and said, if you have moral standing, then you can suffer. And if the only type of suffering there is physical pain, then people with pain asymbolia don't seem to have physical pain. So what happens to them? Do they just lose their moral standing because all of a sudden they just can't feel pain anymore? No, it's complex. And so you have to think about, well, do they have the capacity for it, but they lost the capacity? Was it congenital? Were they born with an inability? What does it mean to be a member of a species that has a capacity and therefore has rights, but you individually don't have the capacity yourself? So these issues come up, they're very technical and require a lot of nuance and reasoning through, but they're important because they're going to help us understand these things. So my research focuses more on the technical side of how do we cut up the differences between these things, but not so much on the pragmatic policy things. I think pragmatic policy things requires a lot of experience with policy making, and that's not something I'm particularly, that's not something I do work on.
So I do have a question that's not related to the pragmatic implementation, I guess, of this. So we were talking earlier about the two different types of consciousness, the phenomenal consciousness and the access consciousness. So I wanted to ask whether or not, like, if there's a creation of an artificial consciousness or some sort of theorization of what that would look like, does that theorization need to include both of those, or are those two separate like types of consciousness in itself? Like, for example, I would assume that, like, I'm able to, since I can see, right, I would have that phenomenal consciousness, but I'm also able to process those things, and have action as well. So I would be able to have both access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. In the creation of, like, this hypothetical artificial consciousness, would it need to have both, or are we tackling one problem at a time? Is that how it's going right now, or like what are your opinions on just those two?
Okay, so at least one thing is clear from your example that's really important is that, I mean, our way of, I mean, at least the way I learned about how to draw this distinction, it just comes down to how I kind of explained it. I mean, it looks like for normal human adults, phenomenal and P, what they call P consciousness and A consciousness, come together, right? And then we notice that in certain sort of abnormal conditions, I guess we could call them, they come apart. And so then we say that one of them will be the A one and one of them will be the P one. And so now we have two concepts of consciousness, as I think the title of the paper is called by Ned Block, Two Concepts of Consciousness. So in the artificial thing, I guess there are three ways this could happen. So one way it could happen is that people just work on building AGI because they think AGI will give access conscious. And then they think that if a system is sufficiently complex, when it has access conscious, phenomenal consciousness comes along for a ride. It's an emergent property of a system that's access conscious. I don't know a lot about that route, but I definitely know about the first part of it, which is just the relationship between. So there might be some relationship between access consciousness and AGI. Okay. Now, if we want to accept that access consciousness is just a different kind of consciousness, then I don't think artificial systems have to be phenomenally conscious in order to be conscious, because access consciousness is a type of consciousness. However, if we blend in the debate about the nature of intelligence, things get kind of complex here, because some people might be saying, well, if the goal is to make machine intelligence be as domain variant as humans are, so that what typically an 8-year-old kid can do, a robot can do, it might be hard then to say that you don't need phenomenal consciousness also. This kind of gets back to the earlier question, because it might be the case that certain levels or kinds of intelligence are correlated with having had phenomenal consciousness at some point or having phenomenal consciousness.
So this is like the thing, like it could be the case that you can lack phenomenal consciousness and do very basic things in a system, but it might be the case that more complex things require phenomenal. And again, I want to be careful here. I don't know that I really believe that, actually. I'm just saying that that's not a position that seems too hard for me to understand someone arguing for. So the idea is basically that, like I give that example, like, people who can have Schadenfreude can pick up that other people might be having Schadenfreude. But people who haven't even had anger, maybe it's easier for them to pick up on people having anger as long as they know what the damn thing is, because it's simply just a more basic state, right? And so Schadenfreude is more complex, it's more nuanced. And so it could be the case that some types of intelligence require being able to think based on what it's like, in the what it's like way, not in the descriptive way. Because I can always tell you kind of what it's like to feel something by describing it. But some people might say that what it's like is richer than the description, and the intelligence is tied to the richness of the description, the richness of the state and not the description. So there are ways to argue this. I mean, there are ways to get into it. It's not a quick thing. It's better to be careful here. But in general, in this area, I would tell people what I find to be really important is be careful about what it is you're interested in consciousness. So for example, like self-consciousness, we didn't even talk about that, right? So we didn't talk about self-awareness of self-consciousness. So for example, having a what it's like feeling might not necessarily be a form of having second order awareness of yourself, for example. Like I'm conscious, like humans have at our age have, self-awareness in the sense of like a second order, like I'm aware of myself as a self, right? Even though Buddhists and neurocognitive scientists sometimes tell us we don't have a self. So what's going on there? We don't have a self that's permanent in time, but I can have the second order state where I recognize myself as a self that's different from yourself. But that type of self-consciousness, I'm not sure that that's 100% quality based as much as it is like being able to have a certain kind of thought, right? It's a thought that is, I am thinking that I am thinking that I'm on a Zoom session right now, right? And sure, that has a quality that comes along with it, but is the quality really the defining feature of it, or is it the thought, right? So again, we have this thing about the attitude and the content of the attitude versus what it feels like. So that's why we talk about attitudes, content, and character, right? So believing something is an attitude, what you believe is the content, and what it feels like to believe it is a character, right? But when we define what your belief is, people sometimes argue we don't define it in terms of how it feels, we define it in terms of what it's about, right? So this is this way of using these different things to cut things up. So that's sort of relevant in this area. Like I think like when you're focusing on this, the most important thing to think about is, given where you want to end up with answering or inquiring things, how are you defining your terms, and are you accidentally mixing up terms that don't have to be put together? And the most common one is intelligence and consciousness.
All right. So it definitely seems that this field of like consciousness in general and its applications to what we, or like that a lot of people would interpret to be artificial intelligence, even though we just learned that artificial intelligence or intelligence and consciousness should not be equated ever. It seems that, this is a very, very big discussion that has a lot of really, really technical aspects. And so in the near future, right, I just wanted to ask you, just because you were talking a little bit about AGI, and this is the last question, but just in the near future, do you see AGI reaching a state of actually achieving access consciousness to the levels that you were describing it?
Well, I think in order for me to give anyone of a reasonable answer to that, you need to tell me, what do you mean by near future? How long out? 5 years?
5, 10 years, yeah.
No.
No?
No. So no, I do have a friend who's a lot better at this particular question than I am. So
Okay.
I prefer to defer to my friend Carlos Montemayor at San Francisco State University, who actually has a paper on this topic about access and AGI. But no, I think from what I listen to in podcasts and who I talk to, I think it is difficult. And here's the reason why. I kind of gave the answer in my earlier answer to you.
Mhm.
And this is something that I don't really know, I'm just being honest with you in terms of how computer scientists think about it. But what is the base for AGI? Again, here's the issue. Like,
Yeah.
is it that it can do how, like if having general intelligence really is stretching across domains, then we're not 10 years away, right? I don't see the mastermind Watson computer being able to do distal tasks from that one task within the next 10 years and do it as well, right? That's the issue. The issue is how distant can the two tasks be, or how distant can the 9 tasks be, because it has to be general intelligence,
Mhm.
and the degree of expertise or difficulty in it, and how are you going for that? So I kind of see it that it might be further out if the way in which we are looking about AGI is that we need to have a wider net of activity. So if they're all like, can you have like a, I mean, I don't think anybody uses the word AGI this way, but can you have like a general, strategic game thing? Yeah, we're probably 10 to 15 years from that, but can we have a general, I mean, can a Tesla car play chess even? On auto, can the auto driving system do it? No, right?
No.
So exactly my point. So that stretching between those kinds of things are probably not that far apart. Okay, so the one last thing maybe you need to think about here is that, so maybe thinking about AGI inside of the way computer scientists talk about is really important. But one thing, if you follow my methodology, one thing you should be looking at is more, are we AGI, right? So here is right. So here's the thing. So there's back in the day, not too long ago, people still talk about it, but there were 2 theories about how the human mind works. One of them is called massive modularity, and one of them is called non-massive modularity. So modularists about the mind basically are people who are influenced by evolutionary psychology and a certain engineering trick. And here's the engineering trick. The engineering trick is that if it's better to burn your resources to make specialized expert systems, it's better to do that than to waste any extra energy to make a domain general system, which won't be able to do everything as good. So there's 2 systems here. So Steven Pinker is a very famous, kind of psychologist / linguist, and he wrote a very famous book, How the Mind Works. I guess it was in the early aughts, maybe late 90s. And in this book, he proposed, on the basis of some work with some evolutionary psychologists and philosophers, that the mind is massively modular. And what did he mean? He means that there is no domain general system that they're all operating under. Rather, it's a bunch of, so the analogy is the Swiss Army knife, right? So where is the domain general thing on a Swiss Army knife? There's a screwdriver, there's a wrench, there's pliers, there's a scissors, there's a cutting knife, because it's all specialized. Why? Because with specialized tools, you're more likely to get the thing you've done at the level you need it done, right? So then Jerry Fodor came around and wrote a book called, Hey, the Mind Doesn't Work That Way, by the way, and argued that massive modularity is false. So I don't know, if you're thinking about AGI, you might wonder, well, why are we trying to build AGI in these systems if we aren't AGI, right? And so again, so I think you now see a little bit of like what my method is.
Yeah.
My method is you want to take this interesting property of a artificial system and you want to pretend like it's some really different thing that I don't know how to deal with it. And I'm just trying to say, bring it back into the things that we're already talking about and debating. And you'll see that basically what's going on with artificial systems can be explored in a comparative way that looks at philosophy from a cross-cultural and a multidisciplinary perspective. And that perspective allows us to understand more of what could be the case for what's going on in a way that allows us to have a very robust theory. Again, it's not aimed at practical policy, but that could be a different issue altogether. I mean, people sometimes ask me, like, if you think that, elements of the environment have rights, how are they supposed to go to the court to stand up for their rights? And I basically say, well, that's a stupid problem because that's about a practical policy problem. That doesn't defeat the thing that doesn't say that the thing doesn't have rights. It says that it doesn't live in a world where it can express its rights. That's a different problem. So I tend to say that practical policy problems should be informed by theory, but sometimes practical policy problems need to be done in a way that lead to principles that don't really have to do with the best way of understanding things, right? It has to do with like, hey, right now we have a crisis. we
Yeah.
need to do so. Yeah. So I just don't like it when the practical policy stuff bleeds into my theory, so that my theory must be giving these practically policy. I don't do philosophy that way. I don't go from the policy to what the philosophy should be. As I go from what the philosophy is and what we might need to do in the world to what policy is. So that's why, the issue of whether or not humans are AGI themselves is something that I would talk about in psychology and philosophy of mind. It's a standard topic. And then what we think about that might influence how we think about what's going on with AGI in artificial systems. And you might want to look at this again on a metric scale. So for example, right, so the computer program that can play AlphaGo, chess, and drive my Tesla is got more AGI than the one that can only play Viswanta Ananda in basically chess, or can only play Kasparov, and doesn't know how to play Viswanta Ananda, right? So that's so if AGI is metricized in the sense of like, okay, how many different things you can do, and what's the distance between the kinds of things you can do in terms of intelligence gaps, if we can make a theoretical notion of an intelligence gap, that seems to be another way of talking about the problem. So I just want to say I think it's important to look at it from, don't ever just assume that because the question is popping out from AI that it's some question which we can't grapple with from the perspective of human, animal, or plant cognition. I think it's important to look at it across all of those.
Yeah, and I think definitely that perspective can, help in a lot of other different subjects, not necessarily just AI, right? Like you can
Yeah.
apply that to every single topic that you're looking at. Definitely. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time in talking about artificial intelligence, or I guess consciousness in general, because we learned that, artificial really doesn't matter in the subject in the field of philosophy yet. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely want to thank you just because, I learned a lot too. Like I made a lot of claims and definitely learned a lot. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a good day. And it was great talking with you.